Well, hey there, good people. This is the Big Heavy, and this is frankly a video that I wish I had come across when I embarked on what was probably the biggest project I've ever undertaken, other than trying to raise a family of reasonable human beings. And that was finishing up and building out the room that you see me sitting in right now, which is part of a detached garage that we had added when we built our house back 2012. So to give you a little bit of that backstory, around that time my wife was pregnant with our second child. The economy was sort of in a weird place. We realized that the house we were living in, which we bought before we had children, was not a great family-friendly house. Maybe you've gone through this experience if you've recently had kids. The considerations you have when you don't have any tiny humans involved in your life are very different than the ones when you start to have little people that don't necessarily understand that running in the road is not a good thing, or running full speed down the rather steep hill in your backyard is probably going to end in disaster. So we were kind of at this point where we need a little more space. We wanted to be on a little quieter street. And ultimately we decided that we were going to kind of move and take all the lessons we had learned and have a house built for us. When we started exploring this process, there was a neighborhood we liked. There was a new street that was opening up. I was able to find a lot kind of back in a cul-de-sac, so we addressed the traffic issues and some of the concerns we had around that aspect of things. The economy was still recovering from the big housing crash that had gone down, so we got pretty good attention and service from our builder. I don't know if that's the case these days. I know, things are in a little bit of a weird place with the broader economy and the housing market in particular. But as we were thinking through what we want in the house, one of my key desired items was to have a separate detached garage. Now, the house plan we were looking at had a nice two-car garage. It was perfect for cars and bicycles and all that sort of thing. But I essentially wanted a man cave, to take the stereotypical term. And I was inspired when I would walk through our neighborhood and I'd see these people that had that exact same configuration, where they had a nice house, they had a decent garage, but then they had this separate building where they had a stall or two of garage, they had a little room over top, and it just seemed like it'd be a great place to have a gym, have a wood shop. I was riding motorcycles at the time, maybe have a little machine shop, have a room upstairs and kind of do whatever with. And I didn't really know what I ultimately wanted to accomplish with having this detached garage, but I kind of knew, I wanted a space down below, I wanted a space up above, and I would figure out what I wanted to put in there eventually. Now that eventually was ultimately, I think, about 4 years later. Now what triggered finally investing the time to get this space done was, it sat for a couple or 3 years. I was kind of getting frustrated with having this, really neat detached man cave that I was severely underutilizing. And once I started the project, I lost my job and figured looking for a new one isn't going to take up every waking hour. It would be great if I had a project that kind of kept me sane during that process, and this seemed like the perfect option. I did the vast majority of work myself. I think the only things I outsourced were obviously building the structure and doing the framing, but it was essentially framed to studs when I started working on it. I did outsource the insulation and the drywall just because those are kind of horrible activities. And in the case of drywall, I think bad drywall looks really bad. So didn't want this to be my learning experience. But I otherwise did the plumbing, did the electrical, pulled the permits, did all the flooring, did the design, all that stuff. And I had never done a project of this magnitude. I think I had built some 2x4 shelves. I built some 2x4 furniture in the house that hasn't yet fallen apart. But what I generally have as a major asset and just kind of how I'm wired is I assume that I can do something unless it's going to risk life or limb. In this case, the only life or limb that I was risking was my own. I'm a bit cavalier in putting myself into ridiculous situations versus doing that to others. And I figured I'd learn some stuff along the way, and I also had a bit of inspiration in that long time before I was born, my grandfather built his own house. He came back from World War II, he didn't have a lot of money. He was an auto mechanic, and for whatever reason, I think mostly to try and save some money, he decided he was going to build his own house. The way he would tell the story is, he would find somebody through a friend of a friend of a friend that knew framing. He would get a 6-pack of beer, have that dude over. They'd drink a few beers. The guy would show him a few things, and then he'd get that part done. Find the other guy that knew plumbing, 6-pack of beer, do that stuff, and kind of rinse and repeat. And that house stood until he ultimately passed away. And he never moved out of it. My mom was born there, her sister was born there. The thing always seemed solid whenever we stayed there and came to visit him. So, seeing somebody that didn't have any official skills or training be able to pull that off kind of inspired me. And, this was a detached garage. It wasn't like my family wouldn't have a roof over their heads or anything like that. So I decided to go after that. Now, with that background out of the way, this will be a multi-part video, just since otherwise I think this would ultimately end up being a 4-hour, massive exposition, and I'm not ready to sit here for 4 hours and talk to the camera. And I'm not going to be able to tell you, the nuances of every single thing I did. I don't have video of most of the work, so we'll have a lot of still pictures, have a lot of voiceover. But what was missing for me when I did this project was a video that kind of tied everything together, that explained the sequence of building a residential structure, that explained some of the terminology, that talked about how these different systems fit together and how to approach everything from designing a space to going through the permitting to, I remember spending hours agonizing over which of the utilities do you do first? Do you put in plumbing first? Do you put in electrical first? Do you put molding and trim on before you lay down your wood floors? So there are all these sort of weird questions that I couldn't quite find. I think what YouTube and some of the other internet resources are really good for is the technical details of performing a specific task. There's probably 100 videos you can watch about installing hardwood floors, which I did up here in the studio and office space. But there aren't a lot of videos that tell you, put in the baseboards before you do the hardwood floors, or put in the baseboards after. Here's the pros and cons of each. Here's what might push you one way or the other, and some of the things that show how these different steps interrelate. So that's what I want to accomplish through this series. So let's start out with kind of the initial design and construction phase. And as I mentioned, I didn't do the actual construction. I didn't put in the foundation. I didn't do the framing. I ultimately built a treehouse that I finished up last year so I could, get those skills of figuring out footers and foundations and all that stuff. But for this project, what we had built was framed, exterior all done, windows in, but just studs and OSB on the inside, which is kind of the raw flooring before you put anything down. But I did make some pretty smart decisions during that process. And again, I had a lot of help from the builder. They were, I would call them kind of an upper mid-range builder where they had some spec house plans, but they gave you some, room to wiggle within those plans, and they were able to answer a lot of my questions. So a few of the smart things I did in the construction phase, and you can apply these if you're constructing a house and want to have a man cave, or if you've kind of got a spot of land and are planning on doing all these things yourself. So the first one was, and this may sound kind of obvious, but adding this detached building. I'm super thankful I have this place. I have a place where I can work. I have a place where I can do this, YouTube studio nonsense. It's a great guest room. There's a little bathroom and shower up here. Downstairs we have some bicycle storage, and we turned it into a pretty effective gym that we, just so happened to finish right as COVID was hitting, and that probably kept us sane and relatively healthy during all that process. So if you're on the fence on, do I add a detached building or not? If you can swing it, I would absolutely recommend adding it. You may want to investigate the route we went, which was have the building built but don't do the interior finishing, since that's where a lot of the cost comes from. That saved us some money at the time of construction when, ultimately we weren't sure where the economy was going, and I was self-employed at the time, so we were looking to save a little bit of the dough along the way. Some of the other smart things I did, adding the bonus room on top, I think was a great idea. There is some optionality if you think you might want to add a bonus room later. You can have them frame a single-story garage so it's appropriately load rated and the footers are rated to add that second floor later. If you don't do that, it's going to be significantly harder to add a second floor onto a structure that wasn't designed for 2 floors. So kind of 2 options if you're thinking in that direction. We also, at the recommendation of the builder, did this second floor in what's called a salt box configuration. Now, typically, a lot of the detached garages I see around here in this neighborhood have a peaked roof, so it's your typical triangle, and apologies for the janky finger, broke that in a mountain biking accident, so just pretend that actually extends and is straight. The challenge with that is you lose some ceiling space on both sides. So in this roof, you can see from the drone footage that I'll add later, it's peaked on one side. We've got a dormer, which is over there, which is kind of where my desk hangs out, and then the back kicks flat out. So you get a lot more space in this room. We have this kind of whole section where we put in the little mini kitchen, we put in the bathroom, and ultimately it gives you a lot more usable space in the room. We do have these nice little, what the builder called Smurf rooms on the side of the dormer, so they give me some room for storage up here. But I would have lost a lot of space, and it would have been a less utilitarian and less functional room if we had just gone for a classic peaked roof. That would have been a particularly acute problem if we didn't have the dormer. So, I would think about, are there roof configurations that give you the maximum space that you can utilize above your garage if you decide to do that room above the garage? Some of the other smart things we did was we had electrical service run to the detached garage. They ran 100 amp service, so there's a little conduit that goes from our house out to the detached garage. The reason I'd highly recommend that is because that may cause them to upsize the electrical service running to your house, which is obviously something you want to do while you're building versus try and retrofit later. I also get kind of nervous on working with anything above about 50 amps, so having some professionals put in the 100 amp service, make sure the panel was in the right place and all that stuff was good, was a smart addition. When we got the place, I think they had a little lonely naked light bulb up here, kind of same thing downstairs, so there were only a couple breakers in the panel, but ultimately I ended up filling up that panel and was able to utilize that service that was run out here. Along those lines, I had the builder add a conduit for low voltage wiring coming out to the detached garage. So if you're unfamiliar, a conduit's basically just a little pipe that goes underground. It goes from the crawl space in our house into the detached garage. And since starting to finish the garage, I've run network out here. I've got cabling for the alarm system, got some audio and video stuff, and have more room for future cables. If I was super smart, I probably would have run fiber out here from the main house, but I've got Cat 6 cable, I think, which gives me gigabit Ethernet out here. I've got some wireless access points, and I'll talk a lot about some of the low voltage stuff I did in the future, but I think having that conduit gives you a lot of optionality. So definitely something I would recommend, and something that's super cheap to install when they're building and they're, ripping up the ground everywhere. And something that, if you have hardscape, if you have driveways, if you have all that stuff, is going to be a lot more challenging to do later on. On a similar vein, I asked for a utility sink out here. In our old house, we had, what the builder called a slop sink in the garage, one of those, big old plastic bin laundry sink type deals. I loved having that. I do a lot of bicycling, so having a place to wash yucky bicycle parts, having a place to clean your hands after they're all greasy and nasty if you're doing something out in the garage made a lot of sense. So I asked for a similar setup out here, and this was another one of those things that was a relatively low incremental cost to add during construction. It would be a lot more expensive post-construction. In this case, because we have a sump pump, since this building is a little bit lower than the grade of the sewer. So essentially what they did was they added a water supply out to the detached garage. So we have one water line coming in, so just cold water. And then all the drains in the detached garage go down to what's essentially kind of looks like a buried trash can. It's a little sump pump, if you're familiar with that. So all the drains from the sink, all the drains from the toilets, all that stuff go into this little holding tank. And there's a pump in there, so when it gets full to a certain level, that pump turns on. It pumps all the yucky stuff back to the sewage line in the house. And that's how we get the bad water out of this building. That would have taken, I would assume, a pretty significant investment to do after the fact. So having all that stuff done when they were doing all the plumbing in the house and had everything ripped up and the ground open and all that stuff, and being able to run some of the piping through the foundation was a pretty smart idea in retrospect. So that brings up the point, to the extent you can, if you're doing new construction or even if you're adding a building to your property, try and think through some of those future needs. Maybe it doesn't seem obvious that you'd want a bathroom or a shower today, but having a water supply run while you're building can be pretty cheap. Having electrical service run can be pretty cheap. Having conduit and stuff put in the ground for future use is much cheaper now than when your foundations are poured and all that stuff. So you don't have to have all the answers. I think it's easy to become super obsessed on, am I going to want, 2 access points versus 1 or 6 outlets versus 7? Don't worry about that. Just try and get some smart decisions done today and, at least have that wiggle room so you don't have to worry about that in the future. The other thing we did that I actually never really thought of and just sort of saw in the plans, but in hindsight is a pretty good idea. This may not be as good for your climate, but we're down in the southeastern United States. It's generally pretty warm. They built the stairs on the outside of the building. So it's essentially deck stairs. You can watch one of my really early videos was about putting Trex on those stairs, which ultimately has held up really well and been good since they get full sun. But what's nice is we don't lose a lot of the room in the building due to stairs. Stairs take a ton of room inside an enclosed space. We would probably have to add about 8 feet of real estate onto the back of the building to have the stairs inside, versus having them externally. Doesn't take that space. It's still easy to get in and out of. You're going to get wet anyway if it's raining, since you have to go outside to go between the two buildings. So it doesn't take a lot away in terms of comfort and usability of the building, but essentially doesn't cost you a bunch of space that interior stairs would have cost us. So with some of that out of the way, let me tell you a bit about what started the actual build. Now, after all our construction was done, we moved into the house. The kids were kind of on their way of growing up and all that stuff. This upstairs area that I'm sitting in now essentially was pretty underutilized. I had a few boxes of random stuff up here. I probably came up here, I don't know, 4 times a year maybe, usually to hide Christmas presents and things like that. So it was essentially unused real estate. I did use the downstairs a little more. I had an exercise bike set up there, had a little workbench, did have some storage, and it wasn't great, but had my sink, had my workbench, had my bike trainer set up. I could get some workouts in and that sort of thing. So I was at least using that downstairs area a little bit more. And ultimately, I was kind of thinking through, hey, I should try and drywall the downstairs. It was just bare studs. It was pretty cold there in the winter and pretty hot in the summer. So I thought, hey, I'll insulate, put drywall up. That's a pretty low cost and fairly quick exercise to get done. But when I started thinking about, hey, I'm going to put drywall up, I started thinking, well, then I'm going to lose access to what's behind the walls. If I lose access to what's behind the walls, then I'm not going to be able to run stuff up to this upstairs room. And ultimately, the scope of my project went from, hey, let's insulate and drywall the downstairs, to what the heck are we going to do with the upstairs? Let's figure all that out and get that done so I'm not closing up the walls and limiting my options in the future. So this is kind of the first part of where I wish I had found a video that broke down some of these processes and how everything fit together, in that I had a relatively simple mission, but that expanded to, all right, I have this blank space upstairs. I don't know what I want to do with it at this point. I know I want to do something cool. I want to maintain some optionality, and I'm kind of being forced to make some commitments and to make some design decisions now, and hopefully those won't limit what I do in the future. So in terms of planning out how I use this space and what I would recommend to you if you've got a similar situation where you've got this unfinished space and you're trying to decide, what do I do with it? And maybe that decision is being driven by, you're looking at doing something in the floor below, you just want to kind of get that project moving, but you're not sure what direction it wants to go in. And the way I started was making a list of both what I would call design principles and must-haves. So the must-haves are pretty straightforward. What did I absolutely want to have in that space? And I wanted a simple toilet. I probably would have been happy with a urinal. Maybe that wouldn't have been very friendly to the females in my family. But my wife said, hey, I'd like to have a shower up there. I'd like to have a little bit of a functional mini bathroom in case we have guests, in case we need that capacity. And I'll talk later when I talk about the bathroom why that's ultimately come in more handy than I ever thought it would be. But I settled in that must-haves on, okay, I should have a bathroom and we should have some sort of shower, although I want that bathroom to take up as little space as possible. Once I had that bathroom on the list of must-haves, all of a sudden that necessitated that I have water to the upstairs, and I started thinking, is there another place I would like water where that would be helpful? And I decided to add this little kitchen/bar area. So you can see how one decision kind of impacts another decision. So those were kind of my must-haves. And then I started thinking about my design principles. And the key one for me up here was flexibility. I wanted a space that I could reconfigure. At the time, I was considering maybe being self-employed again at some point in the future, or trying to do a little technology startup. So I had this idea that maybe this could be a working or collaboration space. I also wanted a home theater of some sort. So I had this idea of, how could we make this a theater, but have that theater piece hidden so you don't, come up there and have the movie seating and have it be sort of a single purpose room. I also had this thought of, even if it's not a collaboration space, even if all that startup stuff doesn't happen, it'd be nice to have a place where I could work when I'm working from home, since we had young kids at the time and it was a little bit tough to do conference calls and things like that with people running around screaming. So I didn't really know what I wanted to do with the space. There's also this idea of what if we need some capacity for guests when they came down to visit us? Would we have the ability to have a guest room. I toyed with the idea of a Murphy bed or something up here at one point. So that flexibility design principle really drove a lot of the decisions I made. And being a visual person, I decided that I need to map this out and to try and experiment with different layouts, kind of get a sense of how the place would work, how it would look. And in my case, I use this application. I think it's called Home Designer or Home Architect. I'll put a link down in the description, but it's essentially a lighter weight version of what real architects use, I guess, or at least that's what they say in their marketing copy. But what I liked is you could draw out a relatively straightforward blueprint of a space. It had a bunch of canned, home type things in there. You could put windows in, you could put countertops in, you could put different types of flooring and wall coverings in and all that stuff. And you could do some rudimentary 3D visualization. So a lot of people like SketchUp, a lot of people really enjoy using that. I tried it and for whatever reason my brain just couldn't wrap itself around SketchUp and I ended up spending hours producing what was basically junk. This Home Designer program I think was $300 or something. It wasn't super cheap, but it was a lot more effective for me for whatever reason. And what I liked is I, obviously was able to measure the space I already had. I could, put those dimensions in pretty easily. I put the windows in where they already were since those were already framed up and ready to go. And then I could experiment with different bathroom layouts. I could experiment with a larger or smaller bathroom. I could get a sense of how that kitchen space would look and how much space that would take up. I could look at things from different angles. You could put little cameras in there and kind of get some three-dimensional views. And when I started making choices on floor coverings and wall colors and all that stuff, I could put in approximations of some of the materials I was considering and get a general idea of what the thing would look like. I also started putting furniture in this, little blueprint type model so I could see, where would I put a couch, and based on that with my movie theater idea, which we'll talk about in a future video, which wall would I want to put the screen on, would I want something mounted on the wall, would I want something that dropped down, how might that look? And essentially you're able to kind of mess around and do all that stuff digitally before you hammer your first nail. Even if you're not a technology person, SketchUp is out there, this Home Designer thing is out there. With my treehouse, I did everything on graph paper. Highly, highly recommend some sort of visualization where you lay out your space. If you're constrained by dimensions, if it's already built, get those on there. If you're thinking about different size buildings, you can plot that out and see what works for you. But try and do some, very rudimentary mock-ups and get a feel for how you want to lay things out before you commit to building. The other place that came in handy was in the permitting process. And I frankly agonized over permitting. I spent probably a week doing research. I had nights where I'd wake up in the middle of the night wondering, do I pull permits? Do I not pull permits? How the heck do I do this? All this stuff. And I essentially worked myself up way more than I needed to for what was ultimately a straightforward process. And I'll add the gigantic disclaimer that permitting is done on some sort of municipal level. In our case, it's at the county level. In other regions, it may be done at the city level or even at a more discrete unit, depending on where you are. Permitting rules vary wildly. I'm about to say a whole bunch of wonderful things about my building department. Your building department may be more wonderful. It may be absolutely horrible. You may not even be allowed to do what I'm about to describe. So, big disclaimer there, check things out. But probably the best general advice I can give you on permitting off the bat is that the building department and the permitting people that are in your jurisdiction ultimately work for you. You're the taxpayer, you're the resident or citizen or whatever. You pay those people's salary through taxes or whatever means they get remunerated on. And I tried to do all this internet research. It wasn't necessarily applicable to my jurisdiction. And I called up the building department. They were super helpful. Anytime I had a question, I'd call them and they'd immediately pick up the phone. They'd transfer me to the right people. They'd answer my questions, which were probably quite dumb and rudimentary. They sent me everything I needed to kind of get through the permitting process. And they were just super individuals. I asked some questions and I've used them before, and everything was answered by them and done in a professional and responsive and eminently reasonable manner. So jump off the internet, if you're thinking about the whole permitting process, call up your building department. And in my county's case, when I started this project as a homeowner, you could pull a permit without any problems. There's a permit application form. You fill out the address, what you're doing. You need a cost estimate, you need some plans of what you're going to do, and by virtue of building everything out in that home designer program, I already had plans. That program did some rudimentary material lists, so I was able to get my cost estimation, and I was able to submit all this stuff, and I think the permit was like $80. It wasn't that expensive or anything, and I got my first construction permit. I was super excited about that. I got the big yellow thing that I got to stick in the window and made me feel like I was some sort of real construction dude. Since then, my county did add a step where if you're a homeowner, you have to file an affidavit and go and file it in the clerk of court that basically says, hey, I'm a big dumb animal, I'm a homeowner, I'm going to pull permits and do work, and I acknowledge that I am indeed a big dumb animal. I've since done that affidavit process. I've pulled some other permits for building stuff, but I'm kind of on the side of, go and pull the permit. There's all sorts of stories on the internet that you can read about, if you don't pull permits, your insurance is going to pay. And there's just as many stories about that's nonsense. The insurance's job is to pay and all this stuff. So do what you want, but I think the ease of dealing with the permits, and just having all this stuff done kind of in a appropriate and workmanlike manner or whatever it is was the right approach for me. I'm not the permit police. I'm not here to tell you how to do your job, but if you are thinking about going and pulling permits, call your building department. Don't listen to what people say on the internet. They should help you, or they may tell you, hey, you as a homeowner can't pull a permit, and that's verboten, and too bad, so sad. In which case, next time your elected officials are running, maybe you voice your opinion in the ballot box that they should be a little more helpful to homeowners. So with that out of the way, before we wrap up the first segment of this, the other piece of advice I'll give you on the overall planning process is have a plan of some sort. You're ultimately the general contractor that's building this thing. Even if you don't sub anything out, you as a general contractor have to keep track of the different systems that are being put into your building and make sure that all the steps are completed before a system can go in. There's a logical flow to how things happen in residential construction. There are some cases where there's a fork in the road and either path is fine. There are other cases where there's a fork in the road, and if you don't go down the proper fork, you're going to screw yourself at a later step. So in my case, again, I'm a technology guy. I'm a bit of a nerd and like to geek out from that stuff. I use Microsoft Project. There's a zillion good alternatives these days, from cloud-based stuff to old-fashioned project planning tools like Microsoft Project. What I'd recommend is get something that's beyond just a simple task list. Try and find something where you can mark dependencies. So if you're not a project guru, a dependency is simply saying, I can't do this thing until this thing up here is done. And if you map all those things out, and we'll talk a little bit about those in future videos, then you can go in and see what's called the critical path, which is essentially all the things you need to do before you can do, this thing down here. That I found to be tremendously helpful, both from the planning piece where I'd have to sit down and say, all right, I ultimately want to be sitting on my butt shooting a YouTube video. What are all the things that need to happen in order to make that occur? And you kind of go back and map all that stuff out, and then hey, tomorrow I got to get some 2x4s and start whacking together a wall for that bathroom. And it also gives you a sense of momentum and accomplishment. I would go through, I would mark when everything was done. I would, break things into big phases and see how they were progressing and see how the overall project was done. And, I'd wake up in the morning
feeling like P. Diddy
and be ready to work. And instead of wondering, shoot, should I start laying down felt paper before I put in the flooring, or should I be, picking out paint colors? I could go to my project plan and say, all right, here's the stuff I should be doing today. Here's what it feeds into tomorrow. And I'd spend the time at night or when I was on the road or when I was tired doing the planning. So when I woke up and I was kind of inspired to go out and swing some tools around, I knew exactly what needed to be done. So with that, highly recommend you mash that subscribe button down there, hit the bell. Don't know what it does, but everyone tells you to hit the bell, so who am I to question that logic? But I will do future videos, and I'm going to cover all the major systems. So I'll talk very briefly about framing, since I didn't do much of it beyond framing up the bathroom that's over there. But I will spend a significant amount of time talking about plumbing, because I think that's 2 steps more evolved than voodoo and black magic. I'll spend a fair amount of time talking about electrical, since that's a shocking topic and well worth addressing, and hopefully get a charge out of that video. We'll talk through choosing flooring and some of the finishing options. I did my own tile setting down in the garage downstairs, did pre-finished hardwood up in the room I'm sitting in now, and ultimately we'll talk about some of the low voltage systems, the movie theater stuff, and some of the design decisions and challenges I had along the way. So look for those next videos in the series. Hope to see you there and wish you well in all your construction endeavors. And sometimes if the thing's not happening, just bring out a bigger hammer, whack it a little harder. Big Heavy, wishing you peace.